Welcome to our third Health Policy Impact lecture on through the CTSI Translational Science Seminar. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Elizabeth Long. Dr. Long is an assistant research professor and the director of research and evaluation with the Evidence to Impact Collaborative at Penn State. Dr. Long has a PhD in clinical and translational science from Virginia Commonwealth University, a Master's of Science in Clinical and Counseling Psychology from New Mexico Highlands University, and a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. Her background is in the etiology and prevention of substance use disorders, and she has most recently been studying translation and dissemination. Dr. Long has been funded by the NSF, the William T. Grant Foundation, the Society for Research and Child Development, Penn State's Consortium for Substance Use and Addiction, and others. Dr. Long's work focuses on investigating strategies for bridging the gap between research and policy using models from the Evidence to Impact Collaborative's research translation platform. So I'm pleased to have Dr. Long here with us today. And again, if you've been to the other lectures, my name is Charlene Schwan, and I am the core lead of the Health Policy Impact Core at Penn State's CTSI. So I hope that you will join me in welcoming Dr. Long.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. My hope today is that this will be interactive, and I welcome your thoughts and questions throughout. I don't intend to take the full time, so I expect that there will be plenty of time left for discussion. So increasing policymakers' use of research evidence can help address many health and social problems, but research needs to be able to reach them. Email messaging offers one way to disseminate research, but with the number of emails that policymakers receive along with their busy schedules, there's a high likelihood that they won't open it and thus not engage with the research that's being sent to them. How can we improve this? Theory suggests that key facilitators of increasing policymakers' engagement with and ultimate use of research evidence is making sure that the research is timely and relevant, as well as facilitating trusting relationships between researchers and policymakers. What is timely and relevant can be determined by meeting with policymakers. For instance, if several different staff have questions about the same topic or reflect similar goals and priorities that would warrant it being timely enough to respond with corresponding research, which subsequently helps to build the relationship and trust. Many dissemination efforts are cold and push irrelevant research that is not a priority for the policymaker at the time, and it's sent by unknown senders, which decreases the chances of them being effective. And then finally, of course, the research needs to be in a brief and skimmable format and not a full-length peer-reviewed manuscript. All of these are ways that research dissemination can be enhanced and improved. And this is how we created the Science Communication Optimizer for Policy Engagement, or the SCOPE model, since all models need a fun acronym. For additional context, this work is situated within the research translation platform of the Evidence to Impact Collaborative, along with 3 other research policy bridging models, including the Research to Policy Collaboration model, through which we were able to meet with policymakers to determine timeliness and relevance. The theory is that the interactions which help us to know what is timely and relevant, inform the content of fact sheets that are disseminated, which can then lead to additional interactions, leading to more fact sheets, and so on. And the cycle keeps repeating. One additional unique thing about SCOPE is that we use continuous quality improvement to be able to continually learn how to increase the reach of the dissemination. These CQI efforts not only increase the reach of the research within that one dissemination, but then we can apply the best performing messaging frames to increase the reach of future disseminations. So more specifically, this is what the scope process looks like. As mentioned, it starts with policymaker interactions, which informs relevant content that we develop in the form of fact sheets. Then we identify relevant state and/or federal policymakers and their staff to disseminate it to. And in this case, relevant means that they work on related committees or have sponsored certain bills or it's their portfolio area. Then we determine what we want to test with the CQI step, such as theories from social psychology, like cognitive processing and persuasion theories, as well as best practices from advocacy organizations like narratives. We randomize the policymakers into different conditions, and then we finally disseminate to them and analyze the results, which forms future disseminations and hypotheses for testing, as well as more interactions. So far, we've done over 80 of these scope trials. And these are some good examples of the responses we received. So for instance, this response is a good example of how disseminations can lead to interactions. We've also received requests for additional information, as well as responses letting us know how they're using the research, which is particularly exciting because that means that they're using it instead of just clicking on it. And so now I want to share some of our early trials that disseminated substance use research and tested the use of narratives, which inspired the hypotheses for the current project. We expect that narratives might be particularly beneficial given that a best practice of science communication is presenting it in ways with which your audience is familiar. And in policymaking, stories are key. As the saying goes, the plural of anecdote is policy. And using narratives is a very commonly promoted practice from lobbyists and advocacy organizations. In one of our earliest trials testing narratives, one of the fact sheet authors also happened to be someone with lived experience. She was willing to share her story for these purposes and have the emails appear to come from her. So we tested her very personal story about how Parents Anonymous helped her in her recovery journey against a control, which just said, we wrote this fact sheet about Parents Anonymous, and here it is. We hope that you find it helpful. And this is where the interaction comes into place. I'm curious as to which one you all think will got the most fact sheet clicks. You can unmute yourself and weigh in. Anybody want to take a shot?
So don't be shy. You can also use the icons. Maybe raise your hand if you think that the narrative would get more clicks than the control. We have one vote for narrative.
Yeah, I don't think I can see the chat with screen share, right? So.
So everyone so far who's weighing in is saying narrative.
Okay.
Yep, we got narrative uses more personal language and is more engaging from Rachel Bishop. And a few people who commented on narrative.
Yes, in this case, the narrative did receive more clicks on the fact sheet link. It was a small difference, but still a significant difference. And then in our next trial, one of the fact sheet authors also happened to be someone with lived experience as well as a substance use researcher. So we thought it would be interesting to test her research narrative, her story of why she became a researcher, like what you might see on a bio page, and her narrative describing her personal lived experience against a control with neither of those narratives. And again, I'd love for you all to weigh in and your thoughts as to which one of these would get the most fact sheet clicks.
So it seems like most people have been entering in the chat, and so you're welcome to do that right now if you'd like. Which one do you think would be more engaging and cause more clicks? So the research narrative, the personal narrative, or the control? We've got one vote for personal narrative. 3 for personal. No difference between research and personal.
Okay, very interesting. We thought that the personal would perform the best in this trial, but in fact, the research narrative had significantly more clicks as compared to the control. But there was no difference between the research and personal narrative, and no difference between personal and control. So again, it was a small difference, but this one had ultimately the most engagement with the research. Okay, so all of this background leads us to the current pilot project for which we received grant funds from seed grant funds from Penn State's Consortium on Substance Use and Addiction, for which Charlene was a co-investigator on. For this pilot project, we supplemented the scope model by adding information gleaned from Policymakers' public discourse to identify what information was relevant and timely, since meeting with policymakers is somewhat time-consuming and often not feasible for a lot of researchers. My hope was that this would provide a supplemental approach that is accessible by more researchers who are wanting to disseminate their work within that relevant and timely window of opportunity. This involved searching public documents such as press releases and newsletters, as well as social media posts from Facebook and Twitter from the previous 30 days to get a sense of what issue areas related to substance use are currently being discussed. We did this using a software program called Quorum, which is a client relationship manager built for legislative outreach, and by searching for keywords related to substance use and commonly used by legislators. So words like addiction and substance abuse, even though that is, I know the field is moving away from that language, but I don't think policymakers have caught up yet. I think they're beginning to, though. So each month for 3 months, the public discourse was pulled and searched to identify relevant topics. And 3 corresponding fact sheets were created by the researchers in our rapid response network through the Research to Policy collaboration. Roughly 11,000 state legislators who worked on substance use related committees in health and child or family policy issues and their staff were randomized into different messaging conditions, testing the use of narratives. We used rapid cycling testing, where one trial occurred each month, and the results informed hypotheses for subsequent trials. And that's how I'm going to present the results. So the test and then the results, so we can kind of go through the journey together. And we tracked clicks on the fact sheet links as well as replies, but that's only available for the second 2 trials. The narratives that we used described people's lived experience with substance use disorder and came from the Story Powered Initiative website, which is led by Glenn Sterner from Penn State, who was also a co-investigator on the grant. And the Story Powered Initiative is an initiative that aims to reduce stigma by sharing stories. So it's a website of people's personal experience with substance use disorder. Okay. In the first trial, I was the sender because I was the fact sheet editor, and we tested the narrative as told in third person. So it's essentially me telling Lauren's story about her experience with substance use disorder against first person. So it's me quoting Lauren and using her first person language. And then against a control where just here's a fact sheet. And so does anyone want to vote or share which one? We thought the first person narrative would be by far have the most.
So you remember that the researcher narrative had the most clicks on one of the previous trials. So so if people wanted to vote third person, first person, or control. Third person, question mark. So maybe a little bit uncertain.
Okay, I don't see a lot of chats coming in, so maybe people are a little uncertain of this one, a little unsure what to expect. So the results were quite shocking to us. The control had 601 clicks as compared to 116 and 100. So the control had far more clicks than both the first and third person. We suspected that this might be because of length. Obviously, this one is much shorter than both of these, and that was a compound we were willing to accept going into this trial because the use of narratives inherently adds length. So for the next trial, we decided to specifically test length from the third person, since there wasn't much of a difference. So we used this long narrative about Courtney's story and a shortened version of Courtney's story against a control without a narrative. Thoughts? Long, short, or control?
Oh, Dr. Long, we have a couple of questions. So Rachel Bishop had also suggested the length effect, and then Jennifer Kowalski said, I wonder if it's also linked to the words evidence-based early on.
Yeah, maybe. That's something we can test in future trials.
But for now, people could vote. Sorry, Dr. Long, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's okay.
So if people could put in their guesses, whether long, short, or control, which one had the most clicks. We have one vote for short. We have one control. Short and control. No statistical difference, but more than the long.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all for voting. The control again had the most clicks on the fact sheet by a lot, both significantly. The short and long both had significantly fewer clicks than the control. And then when we look at replies, the same is true. The control had the most replies, which we generally take replies to mean a positive. They're usually like you saw earlier, requests for additional research or to meet to talk about it. Okay, so we were really wondering what was going on because we expected the narratives to perform better than the control. And so we were wondering what the difference was between these trials and the two earlier ones that we saw when we saw success with narratives. And what we realized was that the sender was different. The sender in the early trials was the narrative author. So in other words, the sender was telling their own story, whereas in these two new trials, the sender was telling somebody else's story. We didn't think it would be possible for the narrative authors from the story-powered website to be contacted to ask if they would be willing to let us send out research under their names, but Dr. Sterner luckily happened to know some of them and was able to coordinate this for us. So in the third and final trial, we were able to test sender effects. So we tested the narrative being told in the third person from one of the fact sheet authors. So this is a fact sheet author telling Erin's story in a shortened, condensed version with a link to her full story, as opposed to a first-person narrative sent from the narrative author. So this is Erin telling her own story, and we sent it out as coming from her name, as opposed to the fact sheet author's name. And then against a control with no narrative, but coming from the fact sheet author. Okay, this final voting, if you'd be so inclined.
If everyone could please vote. Narrative author. We have 1 vote for narrative author. 2 votes.
Okay. Yeah, we expected that as well. And what we found, there was the narrative author first person did have the most clicks, but it wasn't significantly different from the control. And the third person narrative fact sheet author was also not significantly different from the control. However, when we compared just the fact sheet author third person against the narrative author first person, it did become slightly significant. And but then looking at replies, the narrative author first person was significantly different from the control. Okay. So then just to kind of wrap everything up, as with a lot of research, I think that this work produces more questions than answers, and we have a lot more to test. But the results, along with the results from the early trials, seem to suggest 2 things. First, narratives might be an effective strategy for improving research dissemination efforts, but the sender and message frame make it nuanced. It seems that narratives may be at least partially effective when the sender is the narrative author and appears authentic. This may be because it matches policymakers' expectations and they don't feel like they're being manipulated. And then second, we've seen over and over again with our trials that simple normal emails appear to increase policymakers' engagement with research the most, which could be a potential explanation for why the control emails performed better. This may be because it makes it appear that the emails are coming from a constituent rather than a lobbyist or someone with a biased agenda, just a constituent that wants to share this information. So if I have one piece of advice. If you want to share your research with policymakers, it would be to not try so hard and not rely on typical best practices without evaluating the efforts. Just keep it simple and normal. And so just to give a huge thanks to the co-investigators on the SEED grant and the team from the EIC for supporting this work, as well as the consortium's funding, which brought together faculty from several different colleges and units across Penn State. And so I'll take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Long. And we do have a question that started actually while you were talking, which is from Rachel Bishop. And she had asked, could message sequencing be useful, starting with the control message, then sending the short message afterward, after the foot in the door has been achieved?
I'm not sure I'm fully understanding the question, because we do send these like back to back. Are you suggesting that the control gets them interested first and then send narratives?
Yeah, that was what I was interested in. Maybe if that shorter control message were to be sent out, and then that could receive clicks. And then once we see that people are interested or they have clicked on the link, then that automatically generates more of a narrative message to follow up maybe and secure that interest and that persuasion to engage in that material.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting concept. I'd be interested to see if that would work. And then we would just send the narrative to the people who clicked on the control. That's, yeah, definitely an interesting future direction.
So I have a broad, zoomed out question, which is that through the Penn State CTSI, we think about policymakers, not just in terms of formal state policymakers, but also informal policymakers like business leaders, school administrators, etc. And through this policy series, we've been lucky to have, our first lecture was from someone at the Dr. Simon at the LA Department of Health. And then our second lecture was from two health administrators at a local school. And one thing which I thought was interesting was the extent to which there's been synergy in terms of what everyone's been suggesting that researchers do. So I was going to just take the opportunity now to kind of describe what they did and then try to synthesize it with what you have done and then see whether or not you had any other additional thoughts. So
Sure.
So some of the sort of suggestions to researchers were to understand potential conflicting priorities that policymakers may have. The example there was, for instance, trying to alleviate poverty versus trying to improve health by restricting the building of affordable housing right next to highways, for instance. Being timely and having a timely response, understanding how policymakers will use evidence, being trustworthy, and using social media and other avenues to try to reach out and disseminate your information. And what I heard from you, which I thought was really synergistic, was being trustworthy again. And you had said that also keeping it simple and normal, right? So making it seem like you don't have an agenda. And then through the public discourse aspect of the scope model, you also talked about you were looking for what kinds of questions policymakers are asking and what areas they were interested in. So that seems a little bit consistent with this idea of understanding how policymakers will use evidence, being timely, and also understanding what potential conflicting priorities they have. But I was wondering if you had any other thoughts or suggestions for researchers for how they could better disseminate their research.
Yeah. So understanding their conflicting priorities is a good one that we, through the research to policy collaboration model, when we're training researchers who join our network, we we kind of coach them to understand those different nuances and how policymakers can't just implement whatever your research is suggesting, because there are conflicting priorities, as well as extenuating circumstances like budget issues and things like that. So just kind of keeping those things in mind and working to develop a relationship with the key legislators in your state, I think could really make a difference, because relationships are where everything really is in the policy space. So disseminations offer like a broad, wide scale approach, and then it will hopefully get you in the door with the right legislator who can move the needle on your particular issue. There's, yes, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't want to interrupt.
I was just gonna finish with the theories are that, you know, if you want research to be used, it has to be the right researcher at the right time, reaching the right legislator. That's the advice that I would have. That comes from Karen Bogenschneider, who developed the family impact seminars.
Thank you, Dr. Lang. That was really helpful. You know, one thing which I thought was interesting is that my understanding is that, you know, you were sending these out and you didn't necessarily have that prior relationship. And I wonder to what extent, you know, you were talking about the replies that you received. Did they sort of offer an avenue for creating more of a personal relationship? And did you see a difference for that based on whether it was more of the narrative ones versus, you know, the controls?
Right. So with the second trial, we saw that the control had the most replies, which would equate into more meeting requests. And then the same for the last trial, the first person narrative had the most replies. So we did track meeting requests for the second and third trials, and the third trial had 9 meeting requests overall, as compared to the other 2, which had like just 1 or 2. So there was something about the third trial, and the first person narrative author sender had 6 of those 9. So I thought that was really powerful. That 6 might not seem like a ton when we sent it to like 11,000 legislators, but again, it's about reaching the right one, and this is an opportunity to be able to identify which one is the right one.
So what's interesting, what I found interesting, the difference between sort of the prior research versus what you found, was that the personal narrative in the prior research seemed to have an effect, even if it was not, you know, the personal story, but the research narrative, right? This is how I got interested in this particular research. But just saying, I am really motivated by this research because of what has happened to somebody else, doesn't seem to move the needle at all. And so I was wondering if you had any, if you could say a little bit more about that, or thoughts about that, because I think that distinction is really interesting. I know I as a researcher would, you know, if I'm talking to someone external, I might hesitate about sharing sort of my personal reasons for getting into the research, because I might worry that will make me appear biased. And so it's interesting that is not what the previous trial found, and that, but on the other hand, talking about how you were moved by someone else's story did seem to change that.
Yeah, I think that it's about policymaker expectations. So if they see an email coming from a researcher, then I think that they expect a research story. Like, why are you studying this? Why are you reaching out to me with this? And I think in that trial, the research narrative worked well because it seemed authentic and it matched their expectations. Rather than, or also it's about, I think, synthesizing different identities, which might be hard for a policymaker. So a researcher who has lived experience with a substance use disorder, like, we know that could be common, but policymakers, they're like, they can't immediately wrap their head around that. And they think that maybe it's not authentic, or that, you know, it's fake and being used for exploitive purposes. There was something else I was going to say about that. Sorry, I got lost.
Okay. I will
I
say,
just think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, everyone else is welcome to ask any questions. I apologize. I should have mentioned that earlier instead of just monopolizing the conversation. You're welcome to either take yourself off mute and ask your question directly, or you can put it in the chat and I will facilitate. But in the meantime, while people are putting that in, I will ask another question, which is whether you saw differences by political party. Is that something you had looked at?
We did not look at it within these trials specifically. I think that we have looked at it previously, and sometimes we find party differences, but ultimately, because we want to stay nonpartisan, we aren't as interested in those differences.
That makes sense. Thank you. So I know that you gave some advice to researchers, right? You had said that keeping it simple and normal, if you were to reach out to a policymaker, is that something that you would recommend that researchers do if they wanted to disseminate their research? Or is there another way that you would recommend that they get engaged with policymakers?
If you have the time, schedule a meeting with them and discuss the research in person. But again, the disseminations can help you identify which person in your state is the right person and who cares the most about it. So it's kind of like what I presented. It's twofold. They complement each other.
And would you definitely suggest that a researcher contact someone within their own state?
Our experience is that the legislators are most responsive to constituents. So the people in their state, yes.
Right.
Although, I mean, you can have an impact in other states as well. We've seen that too. It's just, you might have the most impact in your own state as a constituent.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Long? Are there any opportunities for graduate student researchers to receive advocacy and/or policy training here at Penn State? I'm very interested in scholar activism, and it is not discussed much in my department.
Yes. So if you join the Rapid Response Network through the Research to Policy collaboration, that will help you get opportunities to become engaged in this sort of work. I'll stop sharing and provide that link.
You know, another option is that the Penn State CTSI, so the Health Policy Impact Core, we do offer sort of opportunities for health policy impact consultations. And so if you were interested in in a particular area, like what conferences do you go to, et cetera, you're welcome to reach out to us. And I will post that link as well. It will go through me. So you will see me again if you were to request one of these consultations. Here is our, so Dr. Long posted the information on the rapid response. And then below her link is mine, which is on the health policy impact consultations.
And I'll say that we do also have an internship program where graduate students can intern with us and get some more hands-on experience on a volunteer basis. I posted that link too for more information. You're welcome to contact me or any of the people on the website about that if you have questions.
Great, thank you. So any final questions before we wrap up? I know we're a little bit early, but this has been a chock full discussion, Dr. Long. So I appreciate your taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right, going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you again, and to everyone who participated and who attended today, thank you. And we will have additional lectures, maybe either next year or the year following. So thank you very much.
Thank you.